welcome everyone to another Sunday night edition of Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. Hope everyone's having a good week this week. I gotta address the elephant in the room, or the love story in the room, before we get started with the book tonight. I got an email from Dave who asked what happened to the movie on Thursday night, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, that was supposed to be on YouTube as well. Well, the algorithm, the stupidity of the algorithm on YouTube made a decision that the movie was not the movie, but it was the 1960s, late 60s TV series, Ghost and Mrs. Muir. So they wasn't a copyright strike, but they held back that it was still under advisement with Paramount Plus. Well, the movie was 20th Century Fox, who is not owned by Paramount Plus. And so you guys on Twitch were able to see the movie, and I'm glad you liked it. I had a few people saying that they enjoyed the movie. Nice love story for everybody. And, well, we decided not to fight it, and we'll just prep better and try to figure out the best case scenario for the upcoming movie for April Fools. That's right. April Fools is on a Tuesday this year, April 1st. On Sunday, before April 1st, I am trying to decide whether on that Tuesday do a special edition show, which I might. Maybe I will. And we have a very fun comedy to share with everybody that night. And I think you guys would enjoy it. It's a lot of fun to watch. And it is the start of one of the greatest comedy groups of all time. I won't tell you until for another couple weeks. We're prepping and getting everything ready to go. But I want to let you guys know I apologize for not being able to get it on YouTube. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, wander over to Twitch, download the app. You'll still be able to see the show there, and you can go back last week, because I don't have much time left to have the movie on Twitch, unfortunately. But if you get a chance to watch it, enjoy it, and thank you. I appreciate it. Tonight, we are continuing with the adventures of the Hardy Boys, the book club, and we've got the next few chapters on the Hardy Boys. Having a little bit of fun with the graphics tonight. And we are, if you guys want to say hi to me, email is right here. And we're going to get started. We've got 4 chapters to get through, because next week is the final 4 chapters of the Hardy Boys' House on the Cliff. When we left off last week, the boys went into hiding in the secret cave because the smugglers were on their way back to the room. We'll find out what happens right now, next, with the Hardy Boys, the House on the Cliff. Chapter 18, A Startling Discovery. The Hardy Boys were tense with realization of their peril. The strong electric light that hung from the center of the ceiling cast such a vivid illumination that they were sure they would be seen, particularly when they found that the boxes behind which they were hidden were spaced some distance apart. But for the folds of silk that hung down over the opening, they would certainly have been seen. "Here's some of that special silk," they heard the first man say. "Perhaps I'd bring it up too." Burke was saying he could handle some more silk. "We're done for," thought Frank. "If he comes close, sure he'll pick up that silk. He'll see us for sure." But the other man objected. "What's the use? You won't get any more thanks for carrying all that stuff up the stairs, even if Bert does take it. If he doesn't, you'll just have to cart it all the way down again. My motto in this gang is to do just what Snackley tells me and no more. I guess you're right. We'll bring up the dope. To the relief of the boys, the man turned away and went back to the other side of the chamber. They could hear a rustling sound. Then came the words, "Well, we got it. Let's go back up." The switch snapped and the cavern was steeped in darkness immediately. It was a darkness immeasurably welcome to the lads crouched behind the boxes. They began to breathe more easily. They could hear the door close, and they could hear the footsteps of the two men as they ascended the stairs in the passageway. When the footsteps could be heard no more, Frank switched on the flashlight with a sigh of relief. That was a close call. Gosh, but I was sure they had us. We wouldn't have had a chance with that pair. You could bet they carry guns. Well, let's follow them. I'm with you. We know we're on the right track, and we know we're liable to blunder right into the whole den of smugglers if we don't watch our steps. It's going to be ticklish from now on. I can't be any more ticklish than it has been. I've lived about 10 years while that pair was in here. They crossed the chamber and again opened the door. Cautiously, they stepped out onto the landing, closed the door behind them, and again confronted a flight of steps. I'll go first, said Frank. Stick close behind me. He decided to turn out the flashlight because it was barely possible that the smugglers might have a guard at the top of the stairs, in which the event their approach would have been discovered. So, in the inky blackness, they ascended step by step. They reached the top of the first flight of stairs, and they found themselves upon a crude landing of planks. It ran along the side of the rock wall for some distance, until it ended in another flight of steps. Here the boys stopped, listened to listen. All was silent as the tomb, save for the distant pounding of the sea upon the cliff. I don't hear a sound, whispered Joe. Come on, came from his brother. The passage through the rock was of considerable depth, and they went up countless steps until their limbs were weary. They had never realized that the cliff was so high until now. But at length they reached the final landing, and there they were confronted by another door. This door, they assumed, either led out into the open or into some cave just below the surface of the ground. Perhaps, thought Frank, it even led into the cellar of the Palooka house. The boys pressed close to the door, taking care to make no noise, and listened. They heard not a sound. Still, with the caution arising from their previous narrow escape, they decided to wait a little longer. As later events proved, it was well that they did. For a while they could hear nothing from beyond the door, and there was no indication that no one was there. But, after listening intently for a long 5 minutes, they heard a queer shuffling sound and a sigh. That was all. Someone in there, breathed Frank in a low whisper. Joe nodded in the darkness. They did not know what to do. It seemed apparent that there was someone beyond the door, possibly a sentry. If there was only one man, it might be possible to attack him and disarm him, although it was scarcely possible that they could do this without noise and without attracting the attention of the smugglers. The problem was solved for them. A door thudded in the distance. There was muffled murmurs of voices, growing in volume, and a trampling of feet. I tell you, this is nonsense. This nonsense has gone far enough. He'll sign, He'll sign right now, or I'll know the reason why. The boys started. For the voice was none other than the voice of the man who ordered them out of the cave that afternoon. That's the stuff, Chief, returned someone. Make him sign and promise to keep his mouth shut. If he doesn't, he'll never live to tell about it. That's one thing sure, snapped the first man coldly. There was the sound of a switch being snapped, and then the boys could see a yellow beam of light underneath the door at their feet. From the sounds, they judged that 3 or 4 men had entered the room beyond. Well, he's still here, said the man who had been addressed as Chief. He strode across the room, and the boys could hear a chair scrape on the floorboard. You'll find that this is an easier place to get into than it is out of. A weary voice answered him. The tones were low. The boys could not make out the words. You're a prisoner here, and you'll be a prisoner here until you die unless you sign that paper. Again the weary voice spoke, but, as before, the tones were so low that the words were indistinguishable. You won't sign, eh? We'll see about that. Wait till he goes hungry for a few days, and then he'll think differently, put in one of the other men. There was a hoarse laugh from his companions. Yes, you'll be hungry enough before we're through with you. I can promise you that, said the harsh voice. Are you going to sign? No, they heard the prisoner in the other room answer. Who was this man who was evidently held captive by the smugglers in the underground room? The same thought was in the mind of each of the boys as they listened to the conversation. You know too much about us. You found out too much, and we'll never let you get out of here to use your information. You may as well get that straight. You've read the paper. If you don't sign, you will starve. The prisoner evidently did not reply. Give him a taste of that hot iron, suggested one of the smugglers. No, nothing like that. It's too crude. I'm giving him his chance. He can sign this paper now or take the consequences. Still, there was no reply. Getting obstinate, are you? You won't even answer me. The leader of the gang was evidently getting mad. Suddenly he shouted out, Sign his paper, Hardy, or you'll starve, as sure as my name is Snackley. Chapter 19. Captured. The worst fears of the party boys were realized. They had been unable to distinguish clearly the voice of the prisoner and the other until then, for it had been muffled by the intervening door, but all along they had suspected that it was their father. Now they knew. And they knew also that he was a captive of Snackley, the head of the gang of smugglers. Joe gave a perceptible start, but Frank laid a warning hand on his brother's arm. Now of all times, there was need for caution. They listened. I won't sign it, replied Fenton Hardy clearly. Snackley replied, You heard what I said. Sign or starve. I'll starve. You'll think differently in a day or so. You're pretty hungry now, Hardy, but you'll be a lot hungrier later on, and thirsty too. You'll be ready to sell your soul for a drop of water or a bite to eat. I won't sign. After all, we're not asking very much. You've discovered a number of things that we want you to forget about. It won't hurt you to go back to Bayport and say you couldn't find anything out about us. Nobody knows where you've been. I found out all I wanted to know about you, Snackley. I've got enough evidence to send you to the penitentiary for the rest of your life. And I have more than that. What do you mean, more than that? I know enough to have you sent to the electric chair. There was a sudden commotion in the room, and 2 or 3 of the smugglers began talking at once. You're crazy, shouted Snackley, but there was a current of uneasiness in his voice. You're crazy. You don't know nothing about me. I know enough to have you sent up for murder. All the reason why you're not going to sign, you're not going to get out of here without a signing of this paper. You can count yourself lucky you have even this chance of getting out alive. By all rights, we should have knocked you on your head and heaved you over the cliff into the sea. I won't sign. Don't be foolish. All we ask you to do is to agree that you won't make any use of the information you have. I admit that you've stumbled onto some of our secrets, and we can't afford to turn you loose and have the federal agents about our ears in no time. You must trust me very much. What is it to prevent me from signing the paper and then going back on my word? Asked Fenton Hardy curiously. We know you too well, Hardy. We know that if you sign that, you'll promise to keep it. Exactly. And that is why I won't sign it. I wouldn't be doing my duty if I agreed to any scheme that would protect you. How about your family? Are you going to doing your duty to them by being so obstinate? There was silence for a while. Then Fenton Hardy answered slowly, I'd rather know that I died doing my duty than to have me come back to them as a protector of smugglers and criminals. You have a very high sense of duty, sneered Snackley, but perhaps you think better of it after a while. Are you thirsty? There was no reply. Are you hungry? Still no answer. I know you are, and you'll be hungrier and thirstier before we're through with you. We'll put food and water in your sight, but you won't be able to reach it. You'll die of thirst and starvation unless you sign that paper. I'll never sign it. All right, come on, men. We'll leave him to himself and give him time to think about it. Foots resounded as Snackley and the others began to leave the room, and finally they died away. A door banged. Fenton Hardy was alone, left alone. Joe made a sudden move to the door, but Frank restrained him. Not just yet, he cautioned. They may have left someone to guard him. So the boys waited, listening intently at the door. But there were no further sounds from within the room. At length, satisfied that his father was indeed left alone, Frank fumbled for the latch on the door. Noiselessly, he managed to open it. He pressed in on the door until it was open about an inch, then he peeped through the aperture. He found himself on the threshold of some sort of cellar, a damp, moldy chamber of about the same size of the storage room in the heart of the cliff, with the difference that whereas the first room was a cave in the rock, this place had been dug out of the earth. It was floored with planks and a lone electric light, casting a yellowish illumination over the scene. There was a crew table and a few chairs, while in one corner stood a small camp bed. On this bed, he spied his father. Fenton Hardy was bound hand and foot to the cot, so tightly trussed up that he was unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. He was lying flat on his back, staring up at the muddy ceiling of his prison. On a chair beside the cot was a large sheet of paper, presumably the document the smugglers asked him to sign. The detective did not hear the door open. As Frank looked at him, he was conscious of a change in the appearance of his father, a change that shocked him extremely. For Fenton Hardy was thin and pale, his cheeks were sunken, and he looked like a man who was famished for want of food. Frank opened the door a little wider and tiptoed into the room. Joe followed quietly. They knew they were in danger of the smugglers returning at any moment. They knew they must work swiftly and quietly if they were to effect the release of their father. A slight sound attracted Fenton Hardy's attention, and slowly turned his head. When his gaze rested on the figures of the two boys who were stealing across the floor towards him, he almost uttered an exclamation of excitement, but managed to check the involuntary utterance, although his face lighted up with relief. Quickly the Hardy boys reached his bedside. Frank withdrew his pocket knife, and without a word, without even a whisper, began to hack at the ropes that bound his father. But the rope The knife was dull, and the ropes were heavy. Joe had lost his knife in the water soon after they left Bayport, and although he searched about the room, he was unable to find one, so he set himself to the laborious business of trying to untie the knots. Every moment was precious. At any second, the boys knew they might hear footsteps of those returning smugglers. They worked with frantic caution, working against time. Frank hacked at the ropes, but the dull blades seemed to make little progress. Joe fumbled at the obstinate knots until his fingernails were broken and he could scarcely loosen the strands. Minutes passed. Slowly and agonizingly, Fenton Hardy could give no assistance. He had to lie in silence, not daring to encourage the lads by a whisper. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of the two boys, by scarcely audible sound of knives against the ropes. At last a knife cut through one of the ropes, and Fenton Hardy's feet were free. Frank pulled at the ropes away, but the loose end fell on the floor with a slight sound. Slight as the noise was, it seemed to them almost deafening in view of the necessity of silence. Desperately, Frank prepared to set to work to cut the other ropes that bound his Fenton Hardy's arms. And, even as he reached over with the knife, they heard a sound that sent a thrill of terror through them. There was a heavy footstep beyond the door through which the smugglers had recently disappeared. Someone was approaching the underground room. Frank strained at the knife, but the ropes were stubborn. The dull blade made little impression at first, but at last the rope began to give, and finally Fenton Hardy gave a mighty effort. It snapped, the detective was free. But the steps had drawn nearer, and was followed by others, and the smugglers were returning. "Quick," whispered Frank as he flung the ropes aside. I can't. Hurry." Fenton gasped out Fenton Hardy. "I've been here too long." He could hardly utter the words. His face showed exhaustion. "Well, we got to hurry, Dad," he said excitedly. "See if you can make it." "I'll do my best," returned his father. "If these fellows come back, let's fight for it," put in Joe desperately. "You bet we will," answered Frank in a voice that meant a great deal. Fenton got to his feet as hastily as he could, but when he stood up on the floor, he reeled and would have fallen if not for Joe grasping his arm. He had been lying bound to the cot so long that he felt weak from the hunger, and the fit of dizziness had struck him. It soon passed, however, and the three hastened to the door through which the Hardy boys had entered. But smugglers were close now. The Hardys could hear the coarse voices just outside the door. There was no chance to escape. Just as the Hardy boys and their father crossed the threshold, the door of the opposite room flung open. Frank had a confused glimpse of a dark man, Snackley, who had seen in the cove that afternoon, with a half-dozen rough men crowding behind him. Then he saw Snackley whip a revolver from his pocket. The chief of the smugglers was filled with astonishment, but did not lose his presence of mind. The weapon was leveled at Frank before he had time to close the door. Snackley did not speak. He pressed the trigger and the revolver roared, the echoes crowding in one after another in the narrow space. The bullet chipped into the wood of the door. Frank ducked. Joe, who was in the lead, flung himself to one side. Fenton Hardy stumbled out of the landing onto the top of the stairs. "Come back!" roared Snackley, plunging across the room. "Come back or I'll fire again." As the smuggler drew closer, Frank crouched for a spring and then leapt directly at Snackley. He struck out at the man's wrist, and the revolver flew out of the rascal's grasp, skidding across the floor in the corner. Then he grappled and was so sudden that he had Frank's attack that the smuggler was taken by surprise. He reeled up against the wall, but his companions rushed to his rescue. Frank was swiftly overpowered and dragged away, while the other smugglers with drawn revolvers pursued Joe and Fenton Hardy out on the landing. Being unarmed, they were forced to submit, otherwise they would have been shot without mercy. The struggle was short. The menacing revolvers gave the smugglers the upper hand. Within 5 minutes, Fenton Hardy was bound to the cot again, while the Hardy boys were seated, trussed up, unable to move, on 2 chairs nearby. They were captors, of the smugglers. Chapter 20. Dire Threats. Snackley, once he had recovered from his first consternation and surprise, was in high humor. Just in time, he chuckled, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. Just in time. If we had been a few minutes later, they'd have been away from us altogether. The Hardy boys were silent. They were sick with disappointment. It had seemed that the escape was certain, and then, in the twinkling, the tables had been turned, and now they were all the worse off than they were before. "What do we do with them, Chief?" asked one of the men. The voice sounded familiar to the boys, and they looked up. Not altogether to their surprise, they saw the fellow was none other than Redhead, whom they had seen at the Palooka place the day Frank discovered his father's cap. "Do with them?" exclaimed Snackley. "That's quite a problem. We have 3 on our hands now, whereas we only had 1. We have to make these 3 people keep their mouths shut instead of only 1. We have 3 people to keep guard over now. We ought to do what we wanted to do in the first place," declared Redhead doggedly. "As long as Hardy is alive, he's dangerous." "You mean we should get rid of him?" "Sure. Who ought to get rid of him? And get rid of those boys of his, too." "That's easier said than done," returned Snackley, but with a sinister look at the man on the cot. "I should think you'd had enough of your consciousness already, Snackley," exclaimed Fenton Hardy. "But I suppose you're hardened enough for anything," he said bitterly. He was thinking more of his sons than his possible fate. "Don't you bother about my conscience," sneered Snackley, but a shadow crossed his face. "What do you know about me, anyway?" he demanded roughly. "I know all about what happened to Felix Palooka. He had that big treasure hidden in that house on the cliff, and you got it, and then you started to use the place as your smuggling operations." "Oh, shut up!" Snackley snapped. "I'm going to fix you and those kids of yours, too. Just wait and see." 4 of the smugglers had been whispering among themselves at the back room during the talk between the chief smuggler and the detective, and now one of these men stepped forward. "Got a word to say to you, Chief," he began, addressing Snackley. "What is it now?" The chief smuggler's voice was surly. "It's about what to do with these 3. Now that we have them as prisoners," returned the man hesitantly. "Of course, your business is your own, and we're not asking any questions about what happened to Felix Palooka, but we're in this game of smuggling, see? We don't stand for anything that's too red-handed." "That's the truth," put in another man. "Kind of chicken-hearted," sneered Snackley. "You look out, or I'll fire the lot of you." "No, you won't, Chief," replied the first man who had addressed him. "We've helped in this smuggling, and we're going to have our full share of what's coming to us." "We got another plan about those 3 prisoners," put in a fellow who had not yet spoken. "I think it'd work out grand." "What plan?" questioned the chief smuggler. "We've been talking about Li Chang." "What about him?" "Turn him over to Li Chang. He's sailing back to China in the morning. Have him put on the boat board this ship." Snackley scratched his head for a moment. Evidently, the idea caught his fancy. "Not bad," he muttered. "I hadn't thought of Li Chang. Yes, he'd be able to look after them. He'd see to it that they never returned," and grinned grimly. "He'd probably dump them overboard before he got to China at all," declared the redhead, smugly. "Li Chang doesn't like to feed passengers if they can be got rid of. So much the better. We won't be responsible. Leave it to Li Chang. The old villain would just love to have the 3 men in his power. He'll attend to them." Snackley reached over and picked up the document from the floor where it had fallen into the struggle. He glanced at it and tore it into pieces. "We won't need this. You've lost your chance, Hardy. If you sign it, you would have been free by now. But you'll never be free, not with the 3 of you knowing our secret. It's too risky. You'll be turning over will be turned over to Li Chang. He brought in a little cargo this week, and his ship is to sail in the morning. You'll go with him." Benton Hardy was silent. He had resolved not to plead for his own safety. "Well," said Snackley, "have you anything to say?" "Nothing. Do with me as you wish, but let the boys go." "We'll stick with you, Dad," said Frank quickly. "We sure will," added Joe. "You certainly will," declared Snackley. "I'm not going to let one of you have the chance of getting back to Bayport with your story." Chief of the smugglers stood in the center of the room for a while, contemplating his captives with a bitter smile. Then he turned suddenly on his heel. "Well, they're safe enough," he said to Redhead. "We have that business with Burke to attend to. You two," he said, speaking to two men, "had better go down to the cove and take the rowboat out. Signal to Li Chang that we need a motorboat sent in at once. The rest of you come and help load Burke's truck. If any nosy police come along and find out in the lane, we'll be done for." "How about them?" asked Redhead, indicating the prisoners. "They're safe enough, but I guess we'd better leave one guard anyway. Malloy, you stay here and watch." Malloy, a surly and truncated fellow in overalls and ragged sweater, nodded and sat down on a box near the door. This arrangement seemed to satisfy Snackley, and after warning Malloy not to fall asleep on the job, and to see that the prisoners did not escape, he left the room, followed by Redhead and the other smugglers, with the exception of two who left by the other door. Their footsteps could be heard as they went down the flight of stairs leading to the bottom of the cliff. A heavy silence fell over the room after the departure of the smugglers. Malloy crouched gloomily on the box, gazing blankly at the floor. The butt of the revolver projected from his hip pocket. Frank strained at the ropes that bound him to the chair, but the smugglers had done their task well. He could scarcely budge. "We're done for, I guess," he heard Joe say. Frank seldom gave up heart, but this time he could see no ray of hope. "I'm afraid so. Looks like we'll be with Li Chang by morning." "But we don't want to go to China, Frank. We may never get to China, Joe. Didn't you hear what they said? For all we know, that rascal Li Chang, whoever he is, may heave us overboard when he gets well into the ocean." "You fellas shut up," growled Malloy. "Shut up and I'll tell you, or I'll make it hot for you," and he tapped his revolver suggestively. After that, ominous silence fell between the prisoners. Joe and Frank were downhearted. It looked like their fate was sealed. Chapter 21. Quick Work. The Hardy boys glanced over at their father on the cot. To his surprise, they saw that he was smiling. Frank was on the point of asking him what he found the situation to smile at, when he caught a warning glance. He looked over at the guard. Malloy was not bothering with the prisoners. He was not even looking in their direction. Instead, his head was already beginning to nod, as though he was going to sleep. Snackley had made a poor selection when he chose Malloy as guard. The man had been the entire previous night, helping in the shipment of the smuggling goods from Li Chang's vessel. He had no sleep that day. He was very tired. Sleep stole upon him without his being aware of it. Several times he straightened up, rubbed his eyes, but eventually would bow his head again and give in to the luxury of a little doze. In the meantime, Mr. Hardy was very busy. He had profited by his previous experience. When the smugglers seized him, he attempted to tie him to the bed a second time. He made use of a trick frequently employed by magicians and professional escape artists, who guaranteed to escape from ropes as straitjackets. He had expanded his chest and held his muscles rigid, keeping his arms as far away from his sides as possible, so that later, when he relaxed, he could find that the ropes did not bind him as tightly as the captors intended. This gave him a small leeway. He found that the ropes were especially slack about his right wrist, and so he began working laboriously to free himself. For a time he thought it would be impossible, and the rope chafed his wrist, but at last he managed to slide his hand. Joe and Frank watched this performance with amazement, and new hope came from their eyes as they saw their father slowly groping for one of the knots. As the detective fumbled at it for a while, it was slow work, for he had but one free hand, but in their haste the smugglers had not tied it firmly, as they should, and before long Fenton Hardy had loosened such extent that soon the ends of the rope fell away. His arms were now free, and he braced himself against the sides of the bed and struggled to release his feet. They had not been bound so securely, being simply tied down under one strand of the rope to the cot, and after silently struggling for a few minutes, he was able to work his way free. The detective's next move was to take off his boots, which he did swiftly and quietly, placing them noiselessly on the bed. Then he crept onto the floor and began to steal over to the guard. Malloy was half asleep, but the detective had not gone more than 2 yards before a slight sound creaking of the floor warned the guard that something was amiss. He turned, blinking. A look of intense amazement crossed Malloy's face, and he opened his mouth to yell for help, but Fenton Hardy leaped across the intervening space and hurled himself upon the smuggler before the guard had time to utter more than a muffled gasp. He clapped one hand over Malloy's mouth and bore the guard to the floor, where he was rolled over in a desperate, silent struggle. Although Fenton Hardy was weakened by his imprisonment and privation, and although the smuggler was strong and wiry, the detective had the advantage of surprise attack, and Malloy had no time to collect his faculties. Joe and Frank watched the battle in agony of suspense. It was, they knew, their last hope. Fenton Hardy still kept his hand over the man's mouth, although Malloy was gasping and gurgling and making frantic attempts to call out for help. The detective dug his knee into Malloy's stomach, and when the smuggler tried to wiggle out of the way, he snatched the revolver. Their hands closed about the butt of the weapon at the same time. The struggle was short and bitter. Malloy tugged at the revolver, trying to draw it from his pocket. Fenton dug his knee in sharply against the man, and Malloy loosened his grip with the groan of pain. The detective snatched the revolver free, then flung himself back, leveling the weapon at Malloy. "Not a word from you," he whispered. Malloy's hands rose in the air. He did not utter a sound. He was sitting helplessly on the floor, his mouth open, closing as he painfully drew breath. He was beaten. The detective spied a knife in the leather sheath at the smuggler's belt, so he reached forward and seized the weapon. Then, keeping Malloy covered with his revolver, he walked slowly backward until he reached Joe's side. Without removing his eyes from the smuggler, Fenton Hardy bent down and sliced the ropes that bound his son. The knife was sharp. The ropes soon fell apart. Joe leaped from the chair, casting aside the ropes. He took the proffered knife. Then his father, still covering Malloy, went over to Frank and set him free. Without saying a word, Fenton Hardy motioned towards the bed and indicated by a sign that the smuggler was to lie down on the cot. A gesture of refusal on the part of Malloy was met by vigorous forward thrust of the revolver, and the smuggler hastily retreated. The ropes on the bed had not been cut, so they were still available for trussing up Malloy, just as Mr. Hardy had been bound. The boys did the job with neatness and dispatch, and they even gagged the smuggler with his own handkerchief, one of the ropes from the chair. Within 5 minutes, the erstwhile guard was lying helpless on the bed, bound hand and foot, gagged so firmly that only a muffled and subdued muttering escaped him. What now? Asked Frank in a low tone. We can't go out by the cove, replied his father. There are two men down there signaling to a motorboat. We'd better go upstairs. Where does that lead to? Outside. It will bring us into the shed near the house. Fenton Hardy moved over towards the door. We haven't any time to lose, he said. I have the revolver. If we meet anyone. He opened the door cautiously and peeped out. There was no one beyond. There was nothing but a flight of steps leading upward into the darkness. The detective went forward, his sons following close at his heels. Step by step, they made their way up into the darkness. For Joe, he had closed the door behind them, and Frank did not dare make use of the flashlight. At last, Fenton Hardy came to a stop. He was fumbling at something immediately above. Then the boys saw a faint opening which grew larger above them and resolved itself into a square of gray light, against which the head and shoulders of their father were fully silhouetted. Fenton Hardy had raised the trap door that concealed the entrance to the underground caves and passages. Mr. Hardy looked out carefully. There was no sign of the smugglers. He proceeded to the very top of the steps, then moved clear to of the stairway. Frank and Joe followed, rising to the ground like mysterious spirits of the earth, and the three stood in the shelter of the shed. It was in the dark night, and the trees were moaning in the wind from the sea. Immediately before them rose the gloomy mass of the house on the cliff. There was no lights. In the direction of the lane they could hear dull sounds, no doubt from the truck that was smugglers were loading goods, which were disposed of by the man called Burke. Safe so far, whispered the detective to his sons. They moved out of the shed, after closing the trap door, stood in the shadows. We can't go by the lane, whispered Frank. There's a prisoner in the cellar of the house, said Fenton Hardy. I hate to go without setting him free. A prisoner? I heard them talking about him. Why can't we go to town for help? Once they find out we're gone, they'll clear out. But three of us can't do much against this gang. They'll capture us all again. The detective considered this for a moment. At last he sighed. Yes, the risk is too great, he said. And I've let you take too many risks already. We'd better get back to town. Having arrived at this decision, they moved slowly across the grass of the yard, heading across towards the bushes that flanked the lane. The great bulk of the old stone house loomed heavily and darkly in the night. Then, suddenly, they heard a harsh sound that struck terror into their hearts. The clatter of the trap door being raised. Next week, we continue with chapter 22 and the last 4 chapters of the Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I hope you guys are enjoying the story. It's been a lot of fun. This is the book we read, the book series that we read every year on our anniversary. And we are celebrating and just wrapping up the anniversary 2 years of doing Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. And I appreciate everybody who has been joining us in this journey. And I appreciate everyone who's been emailing me and sending, greetings and letting me know where you guys are watching. My email is right here, joelk_OG@comcast.net. We will continue next week with the final chapters of the book. And as I said before, I'm sorry about the movie not being on YouTube like I promised. We will try to figure that one out later on for another night. We are going to wrap up the show. I want to thank you all. We made quick time on those 4 chapters. And I think as we reach towards the end of the book, there'll be some big surprises, not only for the smugglers, but for the Hardy Boys as well. We're going to, ooh, I like that little shift in the camera there. We're going to take, we're getting ready to get out of here, but one thing we do, as we always do with the show, we are going to wrap up like we do on the Thursday night show, the Conversation Station, with a final quote for the night. This night, this quote is a pretty powerful quote for what's going on in the world right now and what's going on here in the U.S. And it is from one of the best authors who talks about this kind of thing. Our final quote for the night. Everything faded into the mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became truth. Something similar to what's happening in the world right now, where lies and innuendos are taking over the world and our government, and people telling lies just to get themselves going and to make themselves look good when they're not. Everything faded into mist. The past was erased. The erasure was forgotten. The lie became truth. Legendary author George Orwell, the book, 1984. Maybe we should be rephrasing it to 2025. We'll see. This is Accessibly Live, the book club reading room, every single Sunday night here on the channel. I appreciate everybody watching. When you guys get a chance, please remember, when you have a moment or two or three or four or five, like and subscribe if you get a chance. It helps me out a bit, and it helps the algorithm add a few people who enjoy the stuff and the books and everything we do here. And I thank you all for that very, very much. We're going to get out of here. This is Accessibly Live, the book club reading room. We will see you this Thursday for the Conversation Station, and see you next Sunday for the denouement, the closure of the Hardy Boys, the house on the cliff, here on Accessibly Live. Take care, all. See you soon. Bye-bye.